11 Taliban fighters surrendered to an American patrol in Uruzgan province in March 2009. They had walked 17 kilometers through hostile territory, crossed two valleys controlled by their own forces, and approached the American forward operating base with their hands raised. When the intelligence officer asked through an interpreter why they had chosen to surrender rather than simply disappear into the villages, the senior fighter gave an answer that would eventually reach the desk of a U.S. Army Special Forces major named Colton. The fighter said they had learned the Australians were coming to their valley. He said surrendering to Americans meant interrogation, detention, and eventual release. Contact with the Australians meant something else entirely. Major Colton had served 3 rotations in Afghanistan by that point. He had conducted over 200 direct action missions with Delta Force before transitioning to a staff position at Combined Joint Special Operations Task Force headquarters. He had seen every elite unit in the coalition operate: British SAS, Polish Grom, Canadian JTF-2, and multiple American Tier 1 elements. He considered himself immune to surprise when it came to special operations. The report about the Taliban fighters choosing capture over contact with Australians struck him as propaganda, the kind of exaggeration that spreads through military networks when units compete for resources and recognition. He made a note to investigate and moved on to other briefings. 3 weeks later, Colton received authorization to embed with the Australian Special Air Service Regiment Task Group for a 72-hour observation period. His official purpose was to assess coalition interoperability. His actual purpose was to determine whether the Australians were worth the logistical support they consumed. What he witnessed during those 72 hours would fundamentally alter his understanding of what special operations forces could achieve with minimal resources. The first anomaly appeared before he even met the operators. Colton reviewed the task group's equipment manifest and found numbers that made no sense. The Australian SASR patrol he would observe operated with personal equipment valued at approximately 6,000 Australian dollars per man. His own former unit issued personal equipment packages exceeding $42,000 per operator. The Australians carried Harris RF 7800 radios instead of the encrypted satellite systems American teams considered essential. They wore Cry precision load-bearing equipment that showed visible wear. Their weapons were clean but not new: EF-88 rifles and HK-416 carbines that had clearly seen years of service. Colton's initial assessment was that he was looking at a second-tier force operating on a developing nation budget. But the statistics told a different story. He pulled the task group's operational data from the previous 18 months. The Australian jackpot rate, successful contact with intended targets, stood at 79%. American Tier 1 units operating in the same province during the same period achieved 53%. The Australian compromise rate, operations blown before target contact, was 11%. The American rate was 34%. Most striking was the cost per successful operation figure. Australian operations averaged $41,000, including aviation support. American operations in the same target set averaged $312,000. Colton requested clarification. He assumed the data was corrupted, or the Australians were using different metrics. The intelligence officer who compiled the report confirmed the methodology was identical. The numbers were accurate. The disconnect between equipment quality and operational results violated everything Colton understood about modern warfare. American doctrine held that superior technology multiplied force effectiveness. Better optics, better communications, better sensors, better armor, these factors should produce better outcomes. The Australian data suggested the opposite relationship. Either the Australians had discovered something fundamental that American forces had missed, or their numbers were fabricated. What Colton did not yet understand was that the Australian approach emerged from an entirely different philosophy of special operations, one forged in selection courses that broke 90% of candidates and refined through decades of operations in environments where backup never arrived. The briefing room at the Australian compound was smaller than any tactical operations centre Colton had seen. American TOCs occupied spaces the size of basketball courts, filled with screens displaying satellite feeds, drone footage, signals intelligence, and real-time tracking of every asset in theatre. The Australian version occupied a room roughly 12 meters by 8 meters. There were 3 computer terminals, a wall map marked with grease pencil, and a whiteboard. The lighting was poor, the air conditioning was struggling. Colton counted 7 personnel total, including himself. The patrol leader, a warrant officer whose name Colton was never given, conducted the mission brief in 14 minutes. American pre-mission briefings for comparable operations routinely exceeded 90 minutes. The warrant officer covered the target, the approach, the contingencies, and the extraction in language so compressed that Colton missed several references. When he asked for clarification on the communications plan, the warrant officer looked at him with an expression Colton would later describe as patient contempt. The communications plan was simple: radio silence unless compromise was imminent, 1 satellite check-in per 24 hours, no GPS transponder activation, except for emergency extraction. The patrol would operate for up to 96 hours, with no overhead surveillance, no quick reaction force on standby, and no fire support on call. This was not how American special operations worked. American doctrine emphasized layered support: drones overhead, helicopters on strip alert, artillery pre-registered, and multiple redundant communication systems. The philosophy was simple: an operator in trouble should never be more than minutes away from devastating firepower. The Australian approach seemed to reject this philosophy entirely. Colton raised the obvious question: what happened if the patrol made contact with a force they could not handle? The warrant officer's answer was not what he expected. The Australians did not plan for contact they could not handle because they did not allow situations to develop where such contact became possible. The entire tactical approach was designed around avoiding decisive engagement. If a patrol found itself in a firefight requiring external support, the mission had already failed regardless of the outcome. This was the first crack in Colton's assumptions. American Tier 1 units trained extensively in direct action: raids, assaults, high-intensity combat. They excelled at violence. They could put more firepower on a target in 30 seconds than most conventional battalions could deliver in an hour. The Australians seemed to be describing a different kind of warfare entirely. The patrol departed at 0347, 12 minutes ahead of schedule. Colton was not permitted to accompany them. He would observe via the task group's minimal monitoring capability and debrief the patrol upon return. He settled into the operations center expecting to watch screens. There were no screens showing the patrol. There was nothing to watch. The Australians had gone dark, and they would stay dark until they chose otherwise. Over the next 8 hours, Colton experienced something American operators rarely tolerate: total uncertainty about friendly forces. The patrol was somewhere in a valley system controlled by Taliban elements numbering between 60 and 90 fighters. The Australians had no overhead coverage. Coalition assets were available, but not allocated. The Australians had specifically declined drone support. The single satellite check-in scheduled for 0800 came and went with a 4-word burst transmission: position confirmed, continuing mission. The intelligence analyst in the operations center noticed Colton's discomfort. He explained that the Australian system operated on different principles. American special operations relied on information dominance, knowing more than the enemy at all times, maintaining constant situational awareness through sensors and surveillance. The Australians relied on information denial. Their objective was not to know everything, but to ensure the enemy knew nothing. A patrol with no electronic emissions, no overhead surveillance, no radio traffic, and no pattern of life disruption was invisible in ways that no amount of technology could replicate. Colton pushed back. He argued that information dominance was superior because it allowed commanders to make better decisions. The analyst smiled slightly. He asked Colton a question that would stay with him for years afterward. He asked who made better decisions in the field: a commander in an operations center 50 kilometers away watching a drone feed, or a patrol leader standing in the target area using his own eyes. The analyst then shared something that was not in any official report. He described an operation 6 months earlier where an American Tier 1 element had tracked a high-value target for 11 days using every available surveillance asset. The target location was confirmed through multiple intelligence sources. The assault force launched with complete situational awareness of the target compound, surrounding terrain, and enemy disposition. The target escaped through a tunnel that did not appear on any imagery. $47 million in surveillance technology had failed to detect a hole in the ground that any local Afghan child would have known about. The Australian approach to the same target would have been different. A patrol would have moved into the area weeks before any planned action. They would have observed the compound at ground level, mapped the patterns of life, identified the tunnel entrance through patient watching, and developed human intelligence from local sources. The operation would have cost a fraction of the American effort. The target would not have escaped. Colton recognized the criticism implied in the story, but did not dismiss it. He had seen similar failures in his own career, operations that succeeded on paper and failed in reality because technology could not capture what only human presence could discover. What he did not yet know was how the Australians developed operators capable of this kind of patience. The answer lay 17,000 kilometers away, in training areas most American special operators had never heard of, where the selection standards made Delta Force assessment look comfortable by comparison. The patrol remained invisible for the next 31 hours. The single daily transmission continued, brief, uninformative, and exactly on schedule. Colton found himself checking the clock repeatedly, waiting for updates that never came. The silence was maddening. In his experience, silence meant trouble. Here, silence meant everything was proceeding as intended. Then the transmission at 0800 on the second day contained different information. Target acquired. Extraction requested at grid reference. No casualties. The operations center responded with extraction coordination. Colton expected a lengthy post-mission report via radio. Instead, the patrol maintained silence. They would debrief upon return to base, not before. Even success did not break their communications discipline. When the patrol returned 11 hours later, Colton understood why the Taliban fighters had chosen American capture. What he saw on those operators was not exhaustion. It was something else entirely, a stillness that made the most experienced Delta operators look frantic by comparison. These men had spent over 40 hours moving through enemy territory without detection, eliminating their target without reinforcement, and extracting without a single shot fired that was not precisely intended. But the real shock came during the debrief, when Colton learned what those 96 hours had actually involved, and why the Australian selection process produced operators capable of achieving results that American resources could not buy. The selection process that produced these men began in Bindoon, Western Australia, approximately 80 kilometers north of Perth, in terrain that bore no resemblance to the mountains of Uruzgan, but served an identical purpose: breaking human beings until only those capable of functioning beyond normal limits remained. Colton had read the statistics before deploying to Afghanistan. He knew that of approximately 120 candidates who began each selection cycle, typically fewer than 15 would complete the 21-day initial phase. What he had not understood, until watching the Australians operate, was what that 92% attrition rate actually produced. The navigation marches during Bindoon selection required candidates to cover up to 40 kilometers per night, carrying 25 to 35 kilograms of equipment, using only a compass and map, without GPS assistance, without marked trails, through undulating bushland that offered no landmarks. The American equivalent at Fort Bragg was difficult. Colton had witnessed Delta Force selection, and knew it broke strong men, but the Australian version stripped away every technological crutch that American special operators had come to depend upon. When GPS systems failed in Afghan valleys, when satellite communication dropped, when the infrastructure that American doctrine assumed would always function simply did not exist, Australian operators continued without hesitation because they had never been trained to rely on that infrastructure in the first place. But what happened in the Kora Valley 3 weeks after Operation Monsoon Harvest demonstrated something Colton had never witnessed in 18 years of special operations experience. It revealed the difference between soldiers trained to dominate through superior firepower and soldiers trained to survive through superior patience. The intelligence indicated that a senior Taliban commander named Mullah Qadir had established a temporary command post in a compound approximately 4 kilometers northeast of Kora village. American signals intelligence had tracked communications to the compound for 72 hours. Imagery from a Predator drone showed armed men entering and exiting at irregular intervals. The Combined Joint Special Operations Task Force commander authorized a direct action mission, and because the compound fell within Australian area of responsibility, the operation would be joint. American strike elements with Australian reconnaissance support. Colton attended the planning brief at Taran Kowt. The American component would consist of 16 operators from Task Force Spartan, transported by 2 MH-60 Blackhawks with 2 AH-64 Apache gunships providing close air support. The Australian component would be 8 SASR operators from the same troop that had conducted the Mirabat operation, serving as the reconnaissance element to confirm target presence before the assault. The mission architecture followed standard American doctrine. The Australians would infiltrate on foot 48 hours prior to the planned assault, establish concealed observation positions overlooking the compound, and provide real-time intelligence to the strike force. Upon confirmation that Mullah Qadir was present, the Black Hawks would insert the American assault element, while the Apaches suppressed any resistance. The Australians would maintain overwatch throughout and facilitate the extraction. What Colton did not know, what he would only learn during the catastrophic unraveling of that plan, was that the Australian troop commander had already identified 17 points of potential failure in the American concept of operations and had briefed his operators on contingencies for each one. The first indication that reality would not conform to doctrine came 19 hours before the planned assault. The Australian reconnaissance element, now in position overlooking the compound from 2 separate observation posts, reported that the target had departed the compound at approximately 0300 hours and relocated to an unknown location. Signals intelligence confirmed the commander's mobile phone had moved northwest, toward a village called Sarab, approximately 12 kilometers distant. The American Task Force commander, operating from a joint operations center at Kandahar Airfield, ordered a mission adjustment. The strike would be redirected to Sarab. New imagery was requested. Flight routes were recalculated. The Australians were instructed to relocate to the new target area and re-establish observation positions within 18 hours. Colton was monitoring the operation from the Tactical Operations Center at Taran Kowt when the Australian troop commander's response arrived. It consisted of a single encrypted transmission that took Colton several seconds to fully process. The Australians reported that relocation to Sarab within the specified time frame was not possible without vehicular movement. That vehicular movement through the intervening terrain would compromise operational security, and that they recommended an alternative approach. They would conduct a foot infiltration to Sarab over a 48-hour period, while maintaining surveillance on the original compound in case the target returned. This would require delaying the assault by a minimum of 72 additional hours. The American commander's response was immediate. The delay was unacceptable. Intelligence indicated the target might relocate again within 24 hours. The window was closing. The Australians were ordered to extract from their current positions and prepare for helicopter insertion near Sarab to reduce transit time. What happened next would define the operation's outcome and reshape everything Colton thought he understood about the nature of authority in coalition warfare. The Australian troop commander acknowledged the order. Then he added a single sentence that, under American military protocol, would have constituted grounds for relief of command and possible court-martial. He stated that his element would not conduct helicopter insertion into an area without prior ground reconnaissance, that doing so violated Australian Special Operations Doctrine, and that he was exercising his authority under national command caveats to decline participation in that phase of the operation while remaining available for an alternative employment that conformed to acceptable risk parameters. Colton watched the American operations officer's face shift from confusion to anger to something approaching disbelief. In 18 years of special operations, Colton had never witnessed a subordinate element decline a direct order from a task force commander during an active operation. The American officer demanded clarification through the communications net, asking whether the Australian commander understood he was refusing a lawful order from the combined task force commander. The Australian response was unhurried. The commander stated that he was not refusing a lawful order, he was exercising national command authority over Australian forces as specified in the bilateral agreements governing coalition operations. He added that his recommendation remained unchanged. A 48-hour foot infiltration would provide higher probability of mission success with acceptable risk, while helicopter insertion into an unsurveyed landing zone in hostile territory presented unacceptable risk of compromise and potential casualties. The American commander overruled the recommendation. Task Force Spartan would conduct the assault on Sarab using helicopter insertion without Australian reconnaissance support. The Australians were ordered to extract from their current positions and return to Tarin Kowt. What happened over the following 6 hours would become required study material at the Australian Defence Force Warfare Centre in Williamtown. Cited in classified after-action reviews as a textbook example of why Special Operations Commanders must retain authority to decline missions that violate tactical principles. The Task Force Spartan insertion began at 01:45 hours. Two EMH-60 Blackhawks carrying 16 operators approached the designated landing zone 1.2 kilometers southeast of the Sarab compound. Apache gunship support was on station. Signals intelligence confirmed the target's phone remained in the village. All indicators suggested mission success. The first Black Hawk touched down at 01:48 hours. Before the final operator had exited the aircraft, ground fire erupted from 3 separate positions surrounding the landing zone. The Taliban had anticipated helicopter insertion and prepared a classic L-shaped ambush. Within 90 seconds, one American operator was critically wounded. Both helicopters had sustained damage, and the assault force was pinned in an open field with no cover within 50 meters. Colton listened to the radio traffic from the Tactical Operations Center at Tarin Kowt, his hands gripping the edge of the console as the situation deteriorated. The Apache gunships engaged the ambush positions, but the Taliban fighters had positioned themselves in structures adjacent to civilian dwellings, limiting the effectiveness of aerial fires. The American Ground Force commander reported 3 additional wounded and requested immediate extraction, but the damaged helicopters had returned to base, and backup aircraft were 37 minutes out. The Australian reconnaissance element, still in their positions overlooking the original compound at Cora, positions they had been ordered to abandon, monitored the American frequencies. They heard the calls for extraction. They calculated the distances. They understood that 37 minutes in an ongoing firefight with 3 critically wounded operators represented a potential catastrophe. Then the Australian troop commander made a decision that exceeded his authority under any reasonable interpretation of coalition command relationships. He ordered his 8 operators to move to Sarab on foot, 12 kilometers across hostile territory, to provide support to the pinned American element. The Australians covered 12 kilometers in 117 minutes. They moved through darkness without night vision enhancement for the first 4 kilometers to preserve battery power, navigating by terrain features they had memorized during mission preparation. When they reached the outskirts of Sarab, they split into 3 elements, 2 fire teams and a sniper pair, and approached the Taliban ambush positions from angles the fighters had not considered. The first Taliban fighter died at 03:51 hours, eliminated by a precision rifle shot from 740 meters that the target never heard. The second died 8 seconds later. Within 4 minutes, Australian snipers had neutralized 4 of the 7 Taliban positions, providing effective fire on the American element. The 3 remaining positions, suddenly aware they faced fire from an unexpected direction, attempted to reposition, and exposed themselves to the American operators who had been waiting for exactly that opportunity. By 04:22 hours, the engagement was over. 11 Taliban fighters were dead. The 3 critically wounded Americans had received first aid from an Australian combat medic who had covered 12 kilometers, carrying 17 kilograms of additional medical equipment because he had anticipated casualties the mission planners had considered unlikely. Extraction helicopters arrived at 04:39 hours. Colton read the after-action report 3 times. The section that stayed with him was not the tactical summary or the casualty figures. It was the timeline analysis that showed the Australian element had begun preparing for the foot movement to Sarab before the American commander had given the order to assault, before the ambush had even begun. The Australian troop commander had calculated the probability of compromise during helicopter insertion into an unsurveyed landing zone at approximately 73%, based on pattern analysis of previous operations in the Kora Valley. He had anticipated the ambush. He had positioned his element to respond. He had declined the order to extract precisely because he knew his presence in the area would likely become necessary when the American plan failed. The Americans had operated according to doctrine that assumed intelligence was reliable, that helicopter insertion was faster and therefore better, that technology provided advantages that could compensate for inadequate ground reconnaissance. The Australians had operated according to principles that assumed intelligence was provisional, that speed without preparation created vulnerability, and that the ability to adapt to failure was more valuable than confidence in success. But the implications of what Colton had witnessed extended beyond tactical methodology. They touched on something fundamental about the relationship between resources and capability, between equipment and judgment, between following orders and making decisions. The American operators who had walked into that ambush were among the best trained soldiers in the world. Their equipment was superior to anything the Australians carried. Their helicopter support, their aerial reconnaissance, their communications infrastructure, all of it represented decades of investment and hundreds of millions of dollars in development, and none of it had prevented them from walking into a trap that 8 Australians with less expensive gear had predicted and positioned to mitigate. The question that would occupy Colton for years afterward was not whether Australian methods were superior. That conclusion seemed increasingly unavoidable. The question was whether American doctrine could ever incorporate those methods, or whether the very structure of American special operations made such incorporation impossible. The Australians who had saved Task Force Spartan that night returned to Taran Kowt without ceremony. They cleaned their weapons, submitted their reports, and slept for 11 hours. They did not request medals or commendations. They did not speak to journalists. They simply prepared for the next operation, which would begin in less than 72 hours. Colton requested permission to observe the debrief. What he heard challenged assumptions he had built over 2 decades of military service. The Australian troop commander began not with praise for his operator's performance, but with a clinical analysis of errors. The movement to Sarab had taken 117 minutes, 11 minutes longer than optimal, a delay attributable to a navigational error in the final kilometer that required a 90-second pause to reorient. The sniper pair had engaged their first target before the fire teams were fully in position, reducing the element of surprise by an estimated 15%. The medical support, while adequate, had not included sufficient plasma substitute for the volume of casualties encountered. He did not mention that his element had just conducted a 12-kilometer night march across hostile territory to rescue American operators from an ambush. He did not mention that 3 American lives had likely been saved. He mentioned only the areas requiring improvement before the next mission. Colton understood then what the selection process at Bindoon actually produced. It was not physical endurance, though that was a component. It was not tactical skill, though that was present. It was a form of self-assessment so rigorous that even success was treated as partial failure, a standard so demanding that rescuing allies from catastrophe was not exceptional, but merely adequate. What he still did not understand, what the events of the following weeks would reveal, was why Taliban fighters who encountered these men would choose capture by Americans over continued contact with Australians, and what that preference said about the psychological dimension of special operations that American doctrine had never adequately addressed. The first indication that something fundamental had shifted came 17 days into the joint operation, when Colton's team intercepted a radio transmission that would reshape his understanding of everything he thought he knew about counterinsurgency warfare. The transmission was in Pashto, captured by a signals intelligence platform orbiting at 23,000 feet. The American linguist who translated it initially flagged it as routine tactical communication. Coordinates, movement times, the administrative detritus of insurgent logistics. But a secondary review by an Australian linguist attached to the Combined Joint Special Operations Task Force caught something the American had missed: a reference to the bearded ones, and an instruction that would later appear in classified intelligence summaries across 3 continents. The instruction was simple: if contact with Australian forces became unavoidable, fighters were to attempt surrender to any American unit within range rather than continue engagement. Colton read the translated transcript in the Tactical Operations Center at Tarin Kowt, the fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows across faces that had seen too many midnight briefings. Around him, American officers processed the information with varying degrees of skepticism. Insurgent communications were notoriously unreliable. Disinformation, bravado, deliberate misdirection designed to waste coalition resources. But the Australian liaison officer, a major with 3 rotations in Uruzgan province, suggested they cross-reference the transmission against detainee debriefings from the previous 6 months. The results arrived 47 hours later in a classified cable that Colton would reference in 4 subsequent reports to United States Special Operations Command. Of 112 Taliban fighters captured in Uruzgan province between March and September of that year, 68 had been apprehended by American forces. Of those 68, 19 volunteered during initial interrogation that they had deliberately maneuvered toward American positions after detecting Australian presence in their area of operations. The number was statistically significant. The reasoning was more significant still. The detainees did not describe the Australians as more lethal. American firepower, after all, included precision-guided munitions, attack helicopters, and AC-130 gunships that could level entire compounds. They described something else entirely, something that the American interrogators had initially dismissed as cultural exaggeration, but which the Australian debriefers recognized immediately. They described patience. To understand what the Taliban fighters meant by patience, and why that single word represented a fundamental divergence in special operations philosophy, required Colton to re-examine everything he had observed during the joint operation. The American approach to counterinsurgency had evolved through 15 years of continuous combat operations into a doctrine of relentless pressure. Find, fix, finish. The kill chain compressed to minutes. Targets identified, assets allocated, objectives prosecuted with overwhelming force applied through precision targeting. It was efficient. It was measurable. It produced metrics that briefed well to congressional oversight committees and generated promotions for officers who understood how to frame statistics. The Australian approach operated on a different temporal axis entirely. During the joint operation, Colton had watched a 4-man Australian patrol spend 11 days in a single observation position, overlooking a compound that American intelligence had flagged as a suspected insurgent way station. 11 days. No contact, no engagement, no metrics generated. Just 4 men in a shallow depression in the earth, urinating into bottles, defecating into sealed plastic bags that they carried in their rucksacks, eating cold rations to avoid the thermal signature of heating elements, sleeping in 30-minute increments, while their teammates maintained continuous observation. On the 12th day, they reported that the compound was not a way station, but a civilian residence whose owner occasionally sold fuel to passing vehicles, including some that belonged to insurgent networks. The actionable intelligence from that 11-day observation: a single name, a supplier 2 nodes removed from the Taliban fighters that American forces had been hunting for 7 months. The American response would have been to detain the fuel seller, exploit his network through aggressive interrogation, and action any targets identified within the standard 72-hour exploitation window. Speed, pressure, metrics. The Australian recommendation was different. They suggested leaving the fuel seller in place and using his network as a persistent intelligence source, a window into insurgent logistics that would remain open as long as the source remained uncompromised. The intelligence value of patience over months would exceed the tactical value of a single detention by a factor that could not be calculated in advance, but which experience suggested was substantial. Colton's commanding officer rejected the recommendation. The fuel seller was detained 9 days later in a joint operation that Colton himself helped plan. The immediate intelligence yield was significant. 14 names, 6 locations, a weapons cache that produced satisfying photographs for the weekly targeting summary. Within 3 weeks, the network had reorganized. The new logistics coordinator used different routes, different suppliers, different methods. The window had closed. The hunt began again from zero. The price of Australian effectiveness became apparent to Colton not through operational metrics, but through the men themselves, observed in unguarded moments that revealed what sustained proximity to controlled violence did to human beings who excelled at it. He first noticed it during a routine meal at the Australian compound in Tarankout, 3 weeks into the joint operation. The patrol that had spent 11 days in the observation position had returned for a 72-hour recovery period before their next tasking. Colton had expected the usual post-mission atmosphere he knew from American Special Operations units. Dark humor, the release of tension, stories told and retold until they acquired the polish of legend. The Australians ate in near silence. It was not the silence of exhaustion, though they were certainly exhausted. It was something else, a quality of interior distance that Colton recognized from his deployments, but had never seen so uniformly distributed across an entire team. They spoke when necessary, answered questions with professional courtesy, and retreated to their quarters at the earliest opportunity that did not constitute rudeness. Later, during a conversation with the Australian chaplain, a conversation that Colton initiated because he did not know how else to process what he was observing, he learned that the patrol had been on their 8th rotation to Uruzgan province. 8 rotations. Some of the men had been deploying continuously since 2005. The war had become not an interruption of normal life, but the definition of it. The chaplain, a Presbyterian minister who had requested assignment to the Special Air Service Regiment because he believed that the men who did the hardest work required the most careful spiritual attention, described a phenomenon that Australian military psychologists were only beginning to document. The men did not talk about what they experienced in the field. They did not seek counseling unless mandated. They did not exhibit the classic symptoms of post-traumatic stress that American mental health protocols were designed to detect. Instead, they developed what the chaplain called operational personality, a mode of being so perfectly adapted to the requirements of their profession that it became difficult to disengage even during periods of nominal rest. They could function with extraordinary effectiveness in environments of extreme stress. They could make life and death decisions with clarity and precision under conditions that would paralyze ordinary soldiers. They could sustain focus and discipline across multi-week operations that American units would have considered unsupportable without rotation and relief. But they paid for that capability with something that the chaplain struggled to name. He called it eventually the narrowing. The narrowing manifested in ways that only became visible to Colton after he knew to look for them. The senior operator on the 11-day observation mission, a warrant officer with more than 15 years in the regiment, had been married 3 times. His current wife, Colton learned from conversation with the Australian liaison officer, had filed for divorce 6 months earlier. The warrant officer had not mentioned this. He had not, as far as anyone could determine, discussed it with anyone in his unit. He had simply processed the information, filed it in whatever compartment of his mind contained matters unrelated to operational requirements, and continued with his duties. His patrol performance, by every measurable standard, remained exceptional. A younger operator, 6 years in the regiment and on his 4th rotation, had stopped calling his children during deployments. Not because he did not care, the photographs in his quarters suggested otherwise, but because the emotional transition required to speak with a 7-year-old daughter about school and friends while simultaneously maintaining the psychological readiness to prosecute lethal operations had become, in his words, too expensive. Another had developed what the regimental medical officer described as selective anhedonia, an inability to experience pleasure from activities that had previously provided it. He had been an amateur photographer before joining the regiment, with work displayed in galleries in Perth and Melbourne. He had not picked up a camera for personal use in 4 years. He still carried one on operations, documenting intelligence targets and tactical situations with technical precision. The artistic impulse had simply gone dark. These were not broken men. They were not cases for psychiatric intervention under standard military protocols. They were highly functional professionals performing extraordinarily demanding work at a level that few human beings could sustain. They were, by any objective measure, among the most effective counterinsurgency operators in the world. But Colton began to wonder whether their effectiveness and their diminishment were not separate phenomena, but aspects of a single transformation, whether the capacity to remain motionless for 11 days in a hole in the earth, to suppress every biological imperative except the mission, required the quieting of parts of the self that could not simply be reactivated when the deployment ended. A classified psychological assessment conducted by the Australian Defence Force in 2013, fragments of which appeared in academic literature years later, documented what researchers called the 10 rotation phenomenon. Operators who deployed repeatedly to combat zones showed predictable patterns of adaptation across their first 3 rotations. Stress responses became more controlled. Situational awareness sharpened. The gap between stimulus and response compressed as the brain optimized itself for the specific demands of close combat. Between rotations 4 and 7, a plateau emerged. Performance remained high but stable. The adaptations that had produced exceptional capability appeared to consolidate without further intensification. After rotation 8, something else began to happen. The researchers documented what they termed operational foreclosure, a progressive reduction in the range of emotional and cognitive responses available to operators outside combat environments. Men who had been gregarious became taciturn. Men who had enjoyed complex intellectual pursuits found themselves drawn to simpler activities that did not require sustained engagement. Relationships that depended on emotional reciprocity, marriages, friendships, connections with children, showed measurable deterioration even when no single precipitating event could be identified. The men remained highly effective in their professional roles. Indeed, the research suggested that operational foreclosure might be a necessary adaptation for sustained high performance in extreme environments. The brain protecting itself by reducing the cognitive load of civilian life to allow maximum allocation of resources to survival imperatives. But the cost was borne not by the operators themselves, who often did not recognize what they had lost, but by the families and communities to which they were supposed to return. Colton read a summary of this research in an intelligence digest that crossed his desk 8 months after the joint operation concluded. He recognized in its clinical language the men he had observed in that silent meal. The warrant officer processing his divorce like a targeting package. The young operator who could no longer speak to his daughter without disrupting his operational readiness. What he still did not fully understand. What would require another 18 months and a series of events that no one had predicted was how completely American Special Operations doctrine had missed the lesson that the Australian experience offered. The American response to the Taliban's preference for American capture was, in retrospect, precisely wrong. Rather than examining what psychological conditions produced the Australian reputation, rather than studying how the narrowing of individual operators created tactical effects that no amount of firepower could replicate, American Special Operations Command drew the conclusion that suggested itself most readily to an institution optimized for measurable outcomes. They increased the tempo of operations. If the Taliban feared sustained Australian presence, the reasoning went, then sustained American presence would produce similar effects. The number of missions accelerated. The targeting cycle compressed further. American operators found themselves deploying on consecutive nights, then on multiple missions within single nights, then on rotations that extended beyond their mandated limits because the operational demand could not be satisfied with available forces. The psychological research that the Australian Defence Force had begun to compile found no parallel in American military science until years later, after a series of incidents that the American public would learn about only through investigative journalism and congressional inquiry. The Americans had observed the effects of the Australian approach without understanding the mechanism. They had seen what patience produced without recognizing that patience was not a tactical choice, but a cultural condition, the output of a selection system that identified specific psychological profiles, a training regime that cultivated specific capacities, and an institutional culture that accepted the costs that those capacities entailed. You could not produce the Australian effect by increasing American tempo any more than you could create a marathon runner by having a sprinter run more sprints. The final lesson arrived for Colton in a form he had not anticipated. 11 months after the joint operation concluded, he received an email from the Australian liaison officer who had served as his primary point of contact throughout the deployment. The message was brief: 3 sentences of professional courtesy and an attachment containing a single document. The document was an intelligence summary from a debriefing conducted at Bagram Airfield with a mid-level Taliban commander captured during an operation that Colton had helped plan months earlier. The commander had been wounded during the capture and had spent 3 weeks in medical treatment before becoming available for interrogation. During that interrogation, he had provided detailed information about Taliban command structures, logistics networks, and operational planning that American intelligence had sought for years. The breakthrough had not come through enhanced interrogation techniques or the sophisticated psychological approaches that American doctrine prescribed. It had come, the summary noted, because the Taliban commander had specifically requested transfer to American custody after learning that Australian forces had been tracking him for the weeks preceding his capture. He had provided information not because the Americans had extracted it, but because he had wanted to be captured by Americans rather than Australians, and the information was his guarantee that he would remain in American hands. The summary included a single quote from the commander, translated by a native Pashto speaker, and verified by a second linguist for accuracy. "The Americans fight like lawyers," the commander had said. "They have rules for everything, and if you understand the rules, you can survive. The Australians do not fight, they wait, and when they are finished waiting, there is nothing left to survive."